Have you ever wondered about the surprising origins of some of the world's really distinct cultures? Today we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the fascinating story of the Japanese people, and we're viewing it through the lens of a truly groundbreaking work. We're drawing our insights from part 4 of Jared Diamond's huge book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. It meticulously analyzes how things like geography, environment, and innovation shaped different regions. So our mission today is to cut through all that information, pull out the most important bits, and see how Diamond uses his, well, multidisciplinary approach, everything from biology and linguistics to archaeology and historical records, to answer that really compelling question, who are the Japanese?
This deep dive, it's really designed to offer you a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this. We'll be providing some surprising facts and connecting dots you might not have considered before, hopefully making the whole journey of learning about this really engaging.
Okay, let's unpack this puzzle then. It's pretty intricate. Diamond uses a whole range of fascinating methods to trace the origins of the Japanese people. Let's start with some biological clues, maybe the oldest ones. So we begin with the original inhabitants, the Ainu people. They lived up in Hokkaido and northern Honshu, mostly as hunter-gatherers, though with maybe some limited farming. What's particularly interesting about how they're classified?
Well, what's really intriguing here is that the Ainu are sometimes classified, through various analyses, as a branch of Eurasian Caucasians.
Yeah.
And that's not just some taxonomic detail. It gives us a really compelling look into how deeply interconnected ancient human migrations were, even across huge distances. It kind of sets the stage for later displacements, much like we've seen on other continents where, incoming dominant groups pushed out indigenous populations.
Right, so given that really unique classification for the Ainu, what did the genes, the skeletal structures, the physical appearance of modern Japanese people suggest about their deep ancestry?
The biological evidence, well, it strongly points to a close resemblance between modern Japanese people and populations from North China, East Siberia, and very significantly Korea. Actually, Diamond goes as far as proposing a Korea-Japan twin theory, which basically posits this remarkably close shared genetic and cultural origin. It's a fascinating idea, but it's one that you might find is met with quite a bit of reluctance in some circles in Japan. It forces us to kind of confront how scientific findings can intersect and sometimes, well, conflict with national narratives.
Okay, so biology suggests these strong connections, especially with Korea. But what about language? Do the linguistic clues tell the same story, or is it different?
That's a great question. Japanese is largely considered pretty distinct from other major languages, yet it shares about a 15% similarity with Korean. That's in both grammar and vocabulary.
15%. On the face of it, that might not sound like a huge overlap. How significant is that similarity really in terms of, linguistic history? What does it imply about when they might have split?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, how languages evolve, that 15% similarity actually suggests the two languages began to diverge around 5,000 years ago. To give you some context, think about French and Spanish. Most people find them quite similar, right?
Yeah, definitely.
They only began diverging about 2,000 years ago. So 5,000 years is a long time. And just to add, the Ainu language, it has almost no relation to Japanese, zero, reinforcing just how distinct their lineage is.
Okay, so we have genes and words pointing in certain directions. What about more tangible things like ancient art or historical records? What do they show us?
Well, the oldest known portrait of a Japanese person, it's a sculpture from around 1500 AD. It clearly depicts an East Asian appearance. So that lines up pretty well with the biological evidence we were just talking about.
Right. And this next bit, it's quite stark, especially concerning the treatment of the Ainu people. What do the historical records actually say happened?
Historically, yes. It's quite a grim picture in some ways. The Japanese established trading posts in Hokkaido around 1615. And much like invaders you see on other continents, they systematically pushed the Ainu people off their lands, moved them into protected reservations. By 1869, Hokkaido was formally annexed, and Ainu culture and language were deliberately suppressed, basically eradicated. Diamond draws this striking parallel, noting that this actually happened in Japan decades before similar kinds of events unfolded elsewhere in the world.
Wow. Okay. So considering those interactions and movements, how did this sort of broader stream of cultural influence flow into Japan over time, according to the records?
The historical records, they confirm a pretty clear path of cultural transmission. You see Chinese civilization first influencing Korea, and then Korean culture, in turn, significantly impacted Japan. This included transferring really key innovations, things like Buddhism, various writing systems, metallurgy, advanced craft techniques, even bureaucratic systems. And it's suggested that the ancestors of modern Japanese actually entered Japan before they had their own written language, which, aligns quite neatly with that 5,000-year linguistic divergence estimate we mentioned.
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's delve into two incredibly distinct periods in ancient Japan and a really dramatic shift between them. The super long Jomon era and then the fast-changing Yayoi period. So what characterized the Jomon period? I mean, it lasted for an astonishing 10,000 years.
Yeah, 10,000 years. It's hard to wrap your head around. The Jomon period is defined by its really distinctive pottery. It's decorated with patterns made by rolling or pressing ropes into the clay before it dried. That's actually where the name Jomon comes from, rope pattern. And the Jomon people, they were primarily hunter-gatherers. They were sustained by really abundant seafood, lots of nuts like chestnuts, walnuts, acorns, and various other wild plants.
Okay, and the pottery itself, you mentioned it was distinctive. What do discoveries about it, like maybe its size, tell us about their lifestyle and how their society was structured?
Well, the discovery of really large Jomon pottery, some pieces reaching up to a meter tall, that suggests these weren't nomadic people wandering around.
Right.
They were likely settled in fixed locations. And crucially, they didn't practice agriculture. They had no livestock, well, except for dogs. They lacked metal tools, writing, or even textiles.
So a relatively simple society then, sort of unstratified.
Precisely. Their society appears to have been, unstratified, meaning no distinct classes like chiefs or commoners, that kind of thing.
So how does that compare to other parts of the world around that time? Let's say particularly China, around 400 BC, which is when the Jomon period was ending.
That comparison's important. China, by 400 BC, was a dramatically different place. I mean, completely different world. It boasted stratified kingdoms, wealthy rulers, poor commoners, intensive agriculture going back to 7,500 BC. They'd had writing for 900 years, metal tools for 1,500 years, rice cultivation from 2,200 BC, metal tools from about 1,000 BC. And this advanced civilization, it had already spread to Korea.
Okay, so according to the sort of standard guns, germs, and steel formula, you've got these powerful agricultural nations like China and Korea right next door. Japan should have been invaded, right? Assimilated.
You'd think so. But what's fascinating here is that the typical formula for invasion didn't really apply directly. See, Korea at that specific time was still a relatively poor agricultural society. Meanwhile, the Jomon were, comparatively speaking, rich hunter-gatherers because they had such abundant food resources. There wasn't any direct contact between China and Jomon Japan. And the Jomon really had no compelling reason to adopt what was, at the time, a less productive early agricultural system from Korea. And conversely, Korea didn't have this massive food surplus that would give them a huge advantage needed for dominance over the Jomon.
But then something changed dramatically. Around 400 BC, this is where it gets really interesting, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Around 400 BC, Japan saw this sudden population explosion. But at the same time, the rapid introduction of a whole new lifestyle coming from Korea. This period is called Yayoi, named after a district in Tokyo where its distinctive pottery was first found. And this era marks the first widespread appearance in Japan of metal tools, iron, and organized agriculture, a total transformation.
Okay, so metal tools, agriculture. What other evidence do we find from the Yayoi period that points towards Korea?
Well, the Yayoi pottery itself is strikingly similar to contemporary Korean pottery. We also discover bronze objects, textiles, glass beads, sophisticated underground storage systems, probably for rice, plus distinct burial customs and Korean-style tools and houses. It all strongly suggests a really significant Korean presence and influence.
Right. The source notes this dramatic transformation. 10,000 years of Jomon stability, then just 700 years of Yayoi, but the population increases by an incredible 70-fold. 70 times. What are the main theories for how that happens? Such a massive change.
Yeah, 70-fold is staggering. There are basically three main theories Diamond discusses. One is that the Jomon hunter-gatherers simply evolved on their own into modern Japanese people, adopting agriculture gradually. Two is that there was a large-scale migration of Koreans during the Yayoi period, bringing agriculture, culture, and their genes, essentially replacing the Jomon. Or three, perhaps a smaller, initial Korean migration, introduced highly productive agriculture. This led to a population boom among those migrants and their descendants, who eventually, numerically, overwhelmed the original Jomon population. And Diamond gives this powerful example for the third theory. Imagine just 5,000 Koreans arriving in Kyushu. If their population increased by only 1% per year, which is plausible with productive agriculture, they could have 5 million descendants in 700 years, easily outnumbering the original Jomon population, estimated at perhaps 75,000.
Okay, three theories. So which one does the evidence, especially the biological and genetic stuff from bones, actually support most strongly?
Right, the bones and genes are key here. Comparing skeletal remains and genetic material from Jomon people, Yayoi people, modern Japanese, and Ainu people provides really critical insights. The bones, the skulls of Jomon and Yayoi people are actually easily distinguishable. Jomon skulls, interestingly, look more like modern Ainu skulls than they do modern Japanese skulls. Conversely, Yayoi skulls are most similar to modern Japanese skulls.
So what does that mean for the genetic makeup of modern Japanese people then? If the skulls line up Yayoi modern Japanese, what about the genes?
The genetic analysis backs that up. It generally assumes modern Japanese are a mix, right? Some contribution from the Jomon, who are Ainu-like, and some from the Yayoi, who are Korean-like. And the analysis reveals a general dominance of that Korean-like Yayoi genetic contribution across Japan. So this leads to a pretty strong conclusion. Migrants from Korea were a major, probably the dominant factor in forming the modern Japanese population.
Okay, this seems pretty conclusive on the biological front. But then we circle back to that language question. If there was such a huge Korean influence, maybe even a large-scale migration, why is the linguistic similarity only 15%? That seems off. Here's where it gets really interesting again, doesn't it?
It does raise an important question, yeah. It seems like a paradox. And the source, Diamond, offers a fascinating explanation based on Korean history itself. See, during that Yayoi period, Korea wasn't unified. It was in its three kingdoms era, Silla, Baekje, and Goguryeo. And crucially, each kingdom probably spoke a somewhat different language or dialect.
No.
Modern Korean, the language spoken today, is primarily derived from the language of just one of those kingdoms, Silla.
Okay, but Silla wasn't the kingdom most closely connected to Japan back then, was it?
Exactly. That's the key insight. Historical sources suggest it was the Baekje Kingdom in southwestern Korea that had the closest contacts and interactions with Japan during that formative period. So it's highly probable that it was Baekje language speakers who were among the migrants bringing agriculture and culture to Japan. Later on, Silla unified the three kingdoms. When that happened, the languages of Goguryeo and Baekje gradually faded out on the peninsula, and Silla's language became dominant everywhere. So this historical context provides a really compelling reason for that low 15% similarity. Modern Korean comes mostly from Silla, while modern Japanese was likely influenced heavily by Baekje, an older Korean language variant that's now much less represented in modern Korean.
That makes a lot of sense. It resolves that apparent contradiction. So stepping back, what does this whole deep dive tell us about, the bigger picture, how civilizations evolve, interact, how history isn't always simple?
Well, if we connect this back to the main themes, this deep dive really demonstrates powerfully how things like geography, the environment, and crucially, the spread of key innovations like agriculture and metallurgy, rather than any inherent racial differences, profoundly shape the destinies of different peoples. These are the forces driving what Diamond calls guns, germs, and steel. And the Japanese experience, that transition from a very long-standing hunter-gatherer society to a rapidly transformed agricultural one, mainly through outside influence, it's just a really powerful illustration of these principles at work.
Yeah, it really has broadened my perspective. It shows how these specific cultural and geographical factors can just create these incredibly unique historical pathways.
Absolutely. And it encourages us, and hopefully you listening, to think critically about how different groups of people came to be who they are today, and how those deep historical roots, they still influence national identities, maybe even linguistic connections, in ways that aren't always obvious on the surface.
So for you, our listener, here's a final provocative thought to maybe mull over. We've seen the profound impact of geography, environment, and critical innovations like farming and metalworking on the sort of power map of the ancient world. Thinking about that, what do you think might be the next fundamental force or innovation that could dramatically shift the global balance of power in our current era? Something to think about.